All right. Start it off. Finally, after a 15-minute technical delay, I am so sorry. However, we're going to ask everybody at the table to do an introduction of yourself, your name, class year maybe, your department, and then finally what your favorite part about COP has been. So whoever wants to start.
Great.
She's asking us our name, our age, and grade.
Okay, hi, I'm Michaela. I'm a PhD student in philosophy in my 4th year. I study rural poverty and political here, interested in what climate justice might look like for rural and indigenous communities in the US. My favorite part of COP so far was sitting in on a panel with government leaders from a number of countries, especially Madagascar, and talking about how they are trying to communicate with rural farmers who are sort of on the first lines of experiencing climate disasters, and thinking about how to create a flow that's like a grassroots social system of information to be support communities when they're losing their crops. So like getting the farmers to be able to get farmers quickly and the government to be able to get weather predictions to them quickly. Yeah, anyway, more to say.
All right. Hi, I'm TJ. I'm a senior in environmental studies. Favorite thing about COP cultures, like we're walking and I'm hearing within a 5-minute walk, like a dozen different languages. It's just really cool to see everyone, see how they're dressing. Just everyone brings something different.
Hi, I'm Emma. I'm a senior and I'm double majoring in environmental studies and international studies. And my favorite thing about COP has been the fact, like the atmosphere, there's kind of so much going on at once. And even when at like they bring in panelists from different places. For example, like the vice minister of the environment of Honduras was at a panel in Deloitte, and I got to kind of go ahead and ask a few questions on things that I was interested in. So I think the crazy atmosphere, but also to talk to students and take that time, and you really get to learn a lot from it.
Thanks. Hey guys, my name is Ahmed. I'm a second-year MBA student at the Carroll School of Management. My favorite experience so far at the conference has been we sat in on one of the conversations about AI and how they've been using AI to kind of predict climate change, and for the mitigation has been really interesting sitting in on different countries are kind of bringing to the tables and how they're planning on fighting in like the southern hemisphere. So it's been a really great experience.
Some bread in my mouth, but hi, I'm Grace. I'm a sophomore studying environmental geoscience and economics. My job has been just being a part of the information exchange. Today I had the privilege of being in the blue zone, which is like there's 2 different zones of COP. There's the green zone and the blue zone. The green zone is more like corporate representation, whereas the blue zone is showcasing what the climate action they're taking and what plans they have for the future. And so it was just really a privilege to get to be a part of that cultural and climate action like exchange, and just hearing different people that had expertise within like the same solution speak very, I don't know, passionately about something that they knew well, and just be on a panel with other people.
Hi, I'm Molly. I'm a senior and I study environmental studies. My favorite thing so far has been how easy it is to speak to experts or people who are just very experienced in the field. An example, in the bathroom the other day, and I met this woman. We started chatting, and then 10 minutes later, I saw her like speaking at a panel, and I was very cool to see.
Hi, I'm Corinna. I'm a 3rd year student at the law school. My favorite thing about COP so far, kind of like what Emma said, is the accessibility. You go to a panel, there's so many panels happening at the same time. Sometimes it's overwhelming because there's just so much information out there. And methane, so I got to go to culture in Brazil, Uruguay, and Kenya, and that was cool to see the exchange of information there.
I thought we're done.
Anything else?
Yeah, I think I'll also say, so Praveen, Kumar, Jesse Swan Quinn, and Avneet Hira were the faculty leads here. And I think we can go into the questions. We'll probably say more once we get to the questions.
All right, sounds good. Let's jump right in. These are all going to be individual questions. The first one is for Praveen. You've attended multiple COP meetings over the past. Do you see any difference between Baku and previous COP meetings?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I assume you can still hear us. Well, there are, in terms of the similarities, I would say the common denominator in all of these COP meetings, what I have observed is that the energy and passion of thousands and thousands of people, scholars, practitioners, policymakers, that they all bring in to address one single issue, and that is really making this world better in terms of addressing the issue of climate change. So that's the common thread. So it's the energy which is so infectious. In terms of differences, there are still folks who are still figuring out specific differences. However, there have been some discussions in the sense number of people compared to the Dubai COP here in addition to that, the previous year COP in Dubai, the negotiations are quite slow. The progress of negotiations are slow. The progress of informal consultations that are happening, and there are a lot of back and forth that are also in there, and there are multiple reasons for that. In addition to that, what I have observed personally is that there is not a lot of space for advocacy campaigns or protests right outside the venue. Over the past so many COPs that I have attended, including the one in Dubai, I did witness so many protests really bringing out the issue of climate justice and so on and so forth. There's absolutely no protests or advocacy campaigns outside the venue. I think that is one of the stark differences of these. I think as we move over to more or other conversations, the student delegates can also chime in. So I will stop here.
Perfect. And then for Corinna, what types of sessions have you attended, and what did you learn from each of them?
I think when you hear about COP, you don't really understand the scale to you. We've talked about some of the panels that we've sat on in the green zone. Like we said, that's primarily corporate. However, once you get into the blue zone, every country has a pavilion, same with lots of NGOs. So there's lots of panels that are going on interest of a party themselves. So you kind of get that perspective. Then when consultations, then you can giving their own platform, especially as it comes to text. The multilateral bilaterals are closed, but sometimes you'll see press conferences. And then in the plenary is kind of where we see this high level goal set by the COP presidency. So you get the various degrees of minutia and goal setting, which is very interesting.
Perfect. And then Molly, what has been your most formative experience at COP so far?
Well, I'll start off by saying the green zone and the blue zone, as Grace was mentioning earlier. So I've been spending most of my time in the green zone, which is where a lot of corporations are, and it's not where a lot of that big action is happening in the blue zone. However, I've found that playing your cards right can lead to a lot of great conversations and learning. And a great example of that is that today Emma and I serendipitously found ourselves in a conversation with three of the U.S. diplomats, or three of the diplomats, and it was fascinating, and also I think really important to learn more about. We heard about the bilateral and multilateral negotiations that they do from the policy side of the U.S. delegation. And just an hour before, we'd been talking to Catherine Goldberg, a BC grad who now works as a negotiator for the U.S. And so hearing both sides of that U.S. delegation on the negotiation side and the policy side, for me, taught me a lot more about the COP process, specifically from the U.S. perspective.
Perfect. And then TJ, how has Baku as a city adjusted to COP and the international presence?
Yeah, so Baku and Azerbaijan as a whole only had about a year to plan for COPs. Most countries have at least a year and a half or 2 years. Into Baku before, but I think it's really interesting to see how they really upped like the amount of buses that they're using, promoting more of their transit, and also it's just cool to see like so many different people around the city. Like so many times we've been out to dinner and we look out the window and then it's this random security envoy or other group of people, and it's like I don't know who they are. They could be the finance minister of whatever country. But it's just really cool to see that, like just how, even though it is in such a remote part of the world, like it still is able to bring so many different people in. So that's been cool to see.
That is super cool to see. And then with Jesse, in what ways have you seen regional geopolitics expressed at COP?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So I think about environmental geopolitics a lot in my work, and I've noticed a few really interesting things here at COP and how things are being discussed. Specifically, different resources are being mentioned and used to advance different narratives. For instance, in a lot of the literature around natural resources, water, recently think about in relationship to climate, is something that will drive conflict because there's a scarcity of it, increasingly something to be competed over. But in the Blue Zone today, especially at the presentations from countries in this region, water actually seems to be presented as something not to be fought over, but to be conserved. Like revealing opportunities not just for conflict, but for cooperation. And so I think there's some really interesting intersections in this region, which historically has been fraught with a lot of conflict, for thinking about resources in different new ways that might offer opportunities for, at the same time, those conflicts do remain. And as you look at some of the presentations of different countries, you can see that conflict infused. Just for instance, thinking about some of the border areas in this region, energy infrastructures are being presented as opportunities for the future, specifically for one state over another. So it's been really interesting to think about how these conversations around resources are shaping the different political interests of all the parties involved. It's been really exciting to watch.
And then Emma, how have you been able to further explore your personal interests on climate-related topics while also navigating the green zone?
Yeah, so honestly, before I got to the bit, not skeptical, but I was like, each day kind of has a theme. And so looking at the schedule, I was like, oh, well, kind of my interests only fall into really one day. And so I was like, okay, so I feel like that's the only thing out of it. But I was like actually completely wrong, because even something where today the theme was kind of about like urban planning and transport, which is something that I like surface levelly, like I'm not as interested in. But then you go to a panel and since there's people from so many different backgrounds, you're like, like that's actually ties to something that I'm interested in. You can go after and talk to them about it, and then they just know absolutely everything. So I think it's kind of like going back to what Molly was saying about kind of playing your cards right. And if you kind of just ask the right questions, it's going to be a really fruitful experience for the things that you're specifically interested in, while also just learning about other areas that aren't necessarily like things you know about as much. So
awesome. And then Avneet, in what ways do you think your experiences at COP will inform your work around technology and youth for sustainability education?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I think Ahmed mentioned that, so him and I were both in the first day, we were in this session where they were thinking about how AI could be used when it comes. And it was really interesting to see kind of the higher level policy frameworks and the technologies that are being developed. So there's a new technology testing out in a village near Vishakhapatnam in India, where they're using baseline existing data around flooding, other kinds of scarcity around resources, and then using participatory data collected at the household level to provide additional features to understand kinds of climate-induced shock and the prediction of it. And that was really interesting as someone who does participatory-based action research. maybe we can tie that data collection to then actual community action. And that's something that I'd probably be able to take back to some of the work that I do both in India and then in Kenya, along with Justin Henriquez, who's in the engineering department. The other thing, which I think it's like a little bit of a personal moment, but again, Ahmed and I were in the plenary around. And many years ago, like 10 years ago, I used to work in a nonprofit which was around student advocacy for engineering education and sustainable development. And I who's the current president of that, and he was in there representing his country. And so it was like a really nice moment where I was like, well, when I was opportunity to come to things like this, but the fact that he was there, his country supported him, and he was a pretty big voice in what they were doing. He represents Colombia. His name is Felipe Gallo Gomez. That was really nice, like a nice. And maybe the last tangible thing I'll mention is that in educational assessment, so all the OECD countries use the PISA, which is the program for international student assessment, which tests things like students' literacy, mathematics, and science levels. And so one of the things that was passed, in fact, Azerbaijan is the country that took the lead on it, is adding climate literacy as something that they want to test across all the OECD countries, which as someone who studies that, that's really exciting in terms of that data, one, being available, but also just the legitimization of how important climate literacy is at the K-12 education level.
Awesome, awesome. And then Ahmed, which pavilion showcased the most innovative solutions for climate change, and how can these solutions be scaled or adapted in our community?
Oh, that's a good question. No, I really like all the pavilions were really unique with their different ones. I was kind of blown away with the ones going on in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia and Oman really were kind of surprising for me, the action that they're really taking to try to step up, especially Oman. They're even coming out with their own EV startup company, and they're funding a lot of hydrogen within the area to try and get off of fossil fuels specifically. So I thought that was a unique opportunity for them in order to use their natural resources outside of oil to promote that within the area. And I think within the U.S., I think a lot of these technologies, things that are being developed, could probably be migrated over. It's just gonna take some time to see how things plan out.
Perfect, perfect. And then Grace, today's theme is focused on urbanization, transportation, and tourism. What is one country you learned that has been successful in their initiatives and has given you hope for the future for cities?
Well, similar to Ahmed, I was really floored by all of the innovation and also just commitment to sustainability that each of the pavilions showcased. And I was especially impressed by Singapore. Singapore, I already knew had great and successful initiatives in the green space, especially with carbon sequestration and air pollution technology. But I was really impressed with their focus on city planning or urban planning. There were two different techniques that I learned about when I went to the Singapore Pavilion. One being I think it's called just like the green initiative or the green plan, and how they're trying to bring more forestry and bring more green space. They call them green corridors, actually, to the and I was really impressed with their restoration project that was established in 2022 for introducing more greenery, but also restoring the mangroves. Mangroves are like very species of trees that help a lot with erosion. Singapore is a very unique city, similar to Boston, that it's coastal, but it was like about 30% of Singapore is less than 5 sea level. So rising sea levels is a very relevant topic for the city, and they've made a lot of very impressive measures that I think that will be relevant in American cities from them. So exciting seeing the commitment and all of the excitement too from the cities themselves to develop solutions.
Perfect, perfect. And then finally, Michaela, have your experiences changed the way you think about climate change?
Interesting question. I don't know that I would say they've changed the way that I think about climate change, but I think that like the way that we're talking about climate change is certainly something that is heavy on people's minds right now in a way. The outcome of American politics last week, has sort of been hanging over a lot of the discussions I've heard at COP. But not just that, also sort of the ways in political and capitalistic constraints on the way that we're able to engage with climate change on institutional levels is compounded by about how now that countries like America are impacted by climate change in the communities that tend to resist talking about climate, interested in that polarization aspect. In the same Madagascar panel, there was a comment about like, well, now that North Carolina is being flooded, the U.S. is going to be less inclined to help the global South even more than they already are, or something like this. So I'm those kinds of like power dynamics and how radically important something like polarization in a domestic context gets carried into conversations around the world. We see similar dynamics of like vegan versus farmer sorts of tensions, not just in the United States, but in the UK, in Canada, et cetera, et cetera. So I think like, think about social dynamics in the United States, I'm also thinking about how to bridge beyond that to like sort of international discourse. Yeah.
I'm just going to assume that everybody can hear me. Hi, Leonard.
We can hear you. Yeah.
A question for everyone, but maybe specifically for Professor Hira. I think maybe sometimes there's a tension between whether we think climate change is a problem of lacking technology or lacking initiative. And I guess I would be interested in what your take on that is, and especially, you know, what the conversation has been at the COP this year.
I'm so sorry, but we kind of, I think your voice broke there. Could you repeat, and all for Professor, and then we did hear which professor. So could you please say the question again and tell us specifically for which professor? Sorry.
For you, Professor Hira.
All right, could you say the question again then?
Okay. Sometimes there's a conversation whether climate change or addressing climate change is an issue of initiative or an issue of technology. And I'm interested in your opinion on that and how the conversation's been framed this year at the COP.
Yeah, that's a great. I'm guessing this is Leonard. We can't really see you, but I think I recognize your voice. Anyone else want to answer before I try to answer it?
Go ahead. I'll answer.
Why don't you start? I'll answer.
Well, it's use about technology. How about you?
Yeah, I think technology, I don't think it's a question of technology or initiative. And I think, especially being in the few Blue Zone events I was able to attend on the first day, I think the technology is available to a large extent. And we can keep developing more technology. And I think the initiative at the community level is also present. I think the thing that's keeping us to a large extent is, international collaboration and political will is a big part of it. I'm not saying that all the technologies are present, but I think a lot of the technologies that we use are actually not useful, and in fact, oftentimes create more issues of climate change, climate-induced shock. And so, as engineers, as people who think about engineering, I think it's also important to think about which technologies we perhaps need to stop using, and are there more natural resource related that we could think about. And when it comes to initiative, I think there's no question that at the local level, not a lack of initiative, but I think there are individuals who perhaps have more power, and I think more initiative from that end will perhaps be will cause a bigger change. Praveen, what you like to add?
So let me take a more philosophical route over here. And I read, I think it was 2 years back in one of meetings in Glasgow, I read somewhere that when it comes to addressing climate change, technology can go far, but the final nail in the coffin will only be through the social and the political will. But the flip side is also true that even in an idealistic situation, if you can have like a strong political will, but we need to leverage newer innovations and newer technology to address the situation that we are in. So I think there has to be an optimal blend innovations and political. And I think that's what the COP meetings has been all about. For example, over here, there is a Japanese pavilion, and the logo or the tagline of the Japanese pavilion is Japan, Solutions to the World. And we all really kind of know that Japan, to a great extent, is synonymous to newer technologies and innovations and so on. And their pavilion is a lot about new technologies and innovations. And there's a lot of footfall, so many people attending that pavilion. Also, you see the UN pavilions. There's a lot of political conversations and political debates, plenary sessions, a lot of those conversations also happen. And I think that that also really moves the needle forward. So again, I don't really think that this is an either or a binary kind of a situation. There needs to be an optimal blend and initiatives. Coming from, I mean, I hold an engineering degree and then I'm a social scientist. So there's always a cognitive dissonance within me. Very important, but I really feel that it's just a combination of both of them. However, the bottom line, what I would add is that there needs to be even more research in technology, but there needs to be more concerted effort in bringing politicians around the world to make it happen. One of the downside or critique of this particular COP has been that it hasn't really witnessed some of the key political figures from the countries who are the highest emitters. So, for example, we didn't have the US president attending this COP. We didn't have Indian Prime Minister attending, and I recall we didn't have Chinese Premier attending this COP either. These three countries are amongst the top 4 emitters. So you can pretty much see the lack of the political will in here, at least on the face of it. That needs to really change, and hopefully that will change in the next COP.
I feel like a student should have a last word. What do you guys think? You want to react to what Praveen and I said? Anybody?
Well, I guess we were talking with the members of, and he was saying the kind of importance of initiative in the sense that he was saying like the importance of the COP is a repeating thing, it's a repeating effort of this. I like the same amount of members every year, again and again meeting, even though maybe it wasn't successful, maybe they didn't get their goal out of it. But that process of meeting over and over again creates trust and creates kind of more space for cooperation for countries. So I think the kind of initiative of like having a consistency of it and showing up constantly and trying to always find a solution, even if it's not always successful, is a success in and of itself.
I have no idea who to direct this to, I'll be honest. However, it sounds like a lot of the work that's being discussed at the COP either addresses a mitigation strategy or a prevention practice, either through policies or new technology. Which did you guys see seem to be the most promising, and what do you think we as a society should focus more on given our current standpoint and the current issues we face?
You guys hear that? We see mitigation and prevention, and are there any interesting strategies that we have seen and that we think have promise? Molly? Yeah.
Well, I can start off and fills in because I don't know all of the information. However, I think one of come out of COP20, and it's still in the works, but it's Article 6.4. Essentially, Article 6.4 will allow for all countries to trade carbon credits, meaning that if one country emits less, they could sell it to a different country. But if someone wants to jump in and give more depth on that.
Or any other thoughts?
I think it's good if you talk about the carbon.
So very quickly on the carbon credit, the Article 6 This is basically considered outcomes, very few positive outcomes of this particular. And when they basically come up with structural arrangements of be coordinating the carbon credit market. So that's like I think it's a more organized arrangement henceforth in terms of who will really be coordinating and hosting this entire carbon credit exchanges and so on. And the private sector is really excited about it because that helps in systematizing this entire. In addition to that, this as a climate finance COP. There are still underway in terms of the billions of dollars that could be the target as public finance and how much money the developed country should really put in. And that was one of the conversations that we had today with Catherine as well, and I'm sure the students will discuss more. Tonight, we will have some more evolved text on the climate finance goals. Later tonight, midnight, we will have that draft text on the public domain. So that's also one of the, I would say, outcomes that has been quite encouraging. And the third one that I will use that jumps out of me is this particular COP really witnessed for the first time a relatively more coherent conversation on climate adaptation. And unfortunately, adaptation has almost always received a stepmotherly treatment, if I may, relative to climate mitigation. So this time there have been a number of climate adaptation pavilions and a lot of conversation on climate change adaptation. We have seen in conjunction with health, well-being, child welfare, and so on and so forth. So adaptation has received a lot of momentum as well, and rightly so. If there are other students or faculties who want to chime in. Emma?
I think to Professor Kumar's point, like the articles that are coming out tonight at midnight, and I think they're supposed to have some at around 7 too, right? They have some at 7, some at midnight. So I think a lot of the interesting conversations are going to happen these next upcoming days. I know Captain Goldberg is specifically highlighting that. She said we haven't had too many late nights, but she's expecting a lot more work to be pushed through these next couple of days. So it's going to be really interesting how this COP finishes. Most people seem a little frustrated with the way the negotiations have been going, and a lot really exciting for us and everybody around the world to hear about the opportunities of moving forward for as the COP comes to a close. So it's not that all is going to play out.
Hi, this is Molly. I was wondering if you've seen greenwashing by corporations, or like what you perceive to be as greenwashing.
Ahmed is the MBA.
No.
Ahmed is the MBA student. He is.
I would say there's a lot of greenwashing, but there's more than I expected. So there's a lot of companies over here. I think we too has been kind of interesting. Like McKinsey, for example, pulled out a lot of the delegates. So there's quite a bit of greenwashing, in my opinion, from the talks that we've been to. I don't know. Some people have been to other company organizations. They can speak a little bit too.
I mean, I don't want to accuse any particular country like in a meeting of greenwashing, but I think that at least when we were walking around in the green zone, which is the more corporate section of COP, we were surprised by like the lack of climate literacy from some of the companies.
Yeah.
And like while their solutions I'm sure had good intentions or they came earnestly, some of them I didn't really think were like very sound sustainability policies, and I was very surprised by, I don't know.
For example, Grace and I stumbled upon this caviar brand, and they do like aqua farming, and so they breed sturgeon and then like grow them to maturity, and then cultivate them for caviar. And so the woman or she was telling us kind of how it's like when you buy a tin they take a sturgeon and they release it out into the Caspian Sea.
But because it's aquaculture, like these are very different than just like your average sturgeon that can just like be self-sufficient, you know, swim around.
Yeah, so we kind of asked her like, oh, but how do they? Because they've never had to live on their own, and she was like, oh, you know, we put a tracker on them, so we kind of keep eyes on them.
Yeah, maybe it was a language barrier. That's what we want to assume, but I think that it's honestly just a lack of climate literacy and how animals.
Like the COP29, like the minute you step off the plane, that we were hit with a ton of advertising about Baku tourism and sort of like, I think even the aesthetic of COP29 with like the like overly corporate feel of the entire green zone. I said earlier, it feels kind of like walking through a mall. Like there are some booths that are more flashing pictures and stuff like that than actual information or strategy. And so, yeah, like as you're walking through, there's a lot of just general like a lot of how like poor communities in the United States cope with poverty. So like I remember as I grew up, how like Erie and Pennsylvania would market the Bayfront as this like really cutting edge, like sustainable city that was bringing jobs to its communities and like building all these new fancy buildings and businesses. And Baku's definitely like that, with like really contemporary architecture that's, you know, a stone's throw from like just straight oil fields and like a ton of dirt and just like really crumbly houses. And so like these two worlds could not be more different. Like the pavement within the Capitol is spotless. The conference is spotless and very contemporary, and there's a huge model of the city and everything it's doing for sustainability. But when I came back from a temple today, I had bought like a craft and the bag smells like oil. So like I think there's just a huge, very intentionally curated cognitive, but I also think that it's partly like understand like how countries that want to leverage power in a world order where power is like being fought over in the most subtle of ways, like why they would want to rake in money now when they're worried about scarcity and things like that. I think that's what happens on a micro scale, and we need to think carefully about just playing the blame game and how we're sort of like manufacturing the incentives to participate in it.
Hi, I'm Kira. Hi, Grace. I had a quick question. I took like a theology class last year, and I learned a lot about like the Catholic perspective on climate change. And the Pope like released a document, kind of saying that their stance, the Catholic Church's stance, is that overconsumption is like the root cause of climate change. And I know like a lot of these issues, like you just kind of hear about technological advances and that as a way to combat climate change. But I was wondering if there were any initiatives that you guys had seen looking at addressing the root causes of climate change. I would assume not, but I would be curious to hear if you saw any hints of that in the conversations at COP.
So I think like some of the behaviors that like, if we want to say that climate change is a deeply structural problem and that the structures are failing in the ways in which they've failed to value equity, they've failed to value human cultural biodiversity at the same time as sort of ecological diversity, that like to really think about how to do climate change well and responsibly, I think we need a full paradigm shift in the way we think about our relationship to nature and to other human beings. And I don't see like hungry for those sorts of conversations, but not really knowing how to navigate them. And I mean, this relates back to an earlier point that was made about like the ways in which we frame problems around climate with what opportunities arise, sort of Jesse's point, for cooperation. And so I think like the capitalist sort of machine, industrial machine, this like scarcity competitive thinking is not something that gets openly talked about. We're not talking about sort of like human greed and the kinds of lifestyles that we've come to value and what different kinds of lifestyles might not just like help save the planet, but even make us happier, more fulfilled human beings. And so I personally think that there should be a bigger presence of people like philosophers and theologians, to your point, who serve as those sorts of like cultural reframing leaders, not just at COP, but like in institutions in general, working on community levels, that like when we just spend our time writing papers, morality and how we could like leverage things like indigenous thinking or whatever, it doesn't move the world. So I think we need to create spaces as politicians, as corporate leaders, whatever, to take those kinds of fundamental questions seriously, which is interesting for us coming from a place like BC that supposedly centers that kind of thinking, as well as like professional advancement.
Thoughts on this one? Others?
All right, anybody else have a question? All right, well, I guess we can kind of get things wrapped up on a question we asked last week that we had very interesting answers for. What is the most interesting conversation you've had with someone? Who were they, and what made it interesting?
Good to have students. Interesting conversations.
I guess I spoke with the vice president or the vice minister of environment of Honduras, and over the summer I worked in like one of the things I worked in my job was we were tracking kind of my dry quarter.
I'm so sorry.
We're fine, guys. Nothing happened.
Sorry, the dry quarter in Honduras, and kind of how a lot of farmers have kind of left the region. And so kind of for the first time, they're seeing migration, not necessarily within Honduras, but farmers, which are really important for the agricultural industry, they're leaving Honduras because of migration, because of, so kind of having the ability to talk to them about that and kind of bridge kind of what I worked in. This conversation was really interesting.
Favorite conversation actually at COP has not been with someone I didn't know before. I had a conversation with Dr. Praveen Kumar actually yesterday on the way to COP that really was insightful, and it was a perspective with like natural resources and even geopolitics I hadn't considered before. I think you were talking to me a little bit about how is it 75% of like natural resources 75% of natural resources tend to be concentrated in are predominantly inhabited by indigenous peoples. And so I think that the way that we think about resource conflict, the way we think about combating climate change is really country to country. And that's also an idea that COP really, I think, probably cultivates in each of us, that we think that it's country versus country, but really we should be thinking about how are we treating indigenous people within one country, because of the way that things are trending or seem to be going with natural resources being concentrated in indigenous land, is really how are we going to be treating indigenous people. It's not really a question of country, but talks on that and hear more panels from experts with that. But I was really grateful to I guess have a new perspective on climate change and just climate solutions.
An interesting conversation I had was with a youth organizer in North Carolina. We talked a little bit about North Carolina earlier and proximity of the hurricane that occurred there, and the COP, I think, has illuminated a lot of things within the United States. This youth organizer on climate action within the U.S. and she was talking about how some of her colleagues were organizing at the same time that they were forced to live out of their car because their housing had been destroyed in North Carolina, and there was delegates in the room. I talked, and she was talking about just like it was great to get the perspective of seeing other. It is disheartening to be fighting for the U.S. to take more action in North Carolina, while at the same time other countries are also asking the U.S. to take action, and feel like there might be competing interests when there should be more like collaboration and working together. But it sometimes can feel like they're at odds when we feel, but it's also failing the world.
On a less serious level, I would say yesterday on the bus, I ran into a nonprofit who had some delegates at the conference and ended up spending some time with them. And one particular conversation I found very intriguing was that there was this one delegate from Harvard who had told me she'd found her way into a variety of talks, and behind the U.S. pavilion front desk for some reason, just because she had stood really tall and acted and conducted herself very confidently. So I guess a takeaway from that is as long as I seem like I know what I'm doing, I can really get pretty far. And I think it was a valuable lesson.
And very quickly, Molly, I assume you're self-invited to have dinner with them.
They invited me. They also invited me to have dinner. Yeah.
Lovely.
All right. Well, I think that wraps it up. Well, thank you all so much overseas for joining in. Sorry about the technical difficulties. It's always hard trying to zoom in from different countries. Thank you all for being here in person.
May I quickly add
Yeah.
one final statement, if you have time? So, as a co-lead for these COP meetings that I've done multiple times for BC delegates, I think there are two things that I would really want to underscore. The first is that it takes a lot of effort to bring the student delegates and the faculty delegates over here, and that's why we really think that we must. I really want to underscore the effort of the Schiller Institute in really making this happen every year. A lot of effort. So we are grateful to the Schiller Institute and particularly to Kaylee, if you are there.
Yes.
Yay.
So thanks so much, Kaylee, and the Schiller Institute, and of course, by extension, the support us in attending these crucial meetings. And also, one of the key outcomes that I've observed over these years is that as delegates, when we are here, regardless of week 1 or week 2, that kind of a network or camaraderie between the faculties and the students. We tend to be actually educated far more than I believe I really engage and educate the students over here. We tend to really know more about their interests, their career interests, and so on. So it really builds a community and builds this network of climate scholars. That's great. So thank you so much to Schiller Institute, BC leadership, and as well who have taken out time to do this.
Very well said. Great.
Yeah. So happy to see you there soaking it up.
Awesome. We'll hopefully get some
and
sleep.
maybe 2 more days, so I will be WhatsApping you, for other things.
There we go. Well, thank you so much. I know it's 9 o'clock there, so hopefully get some sleep. Enjoy the last couple of days of COP, and thank you all again for being here. We'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.